You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
My name is Greg Jackson. I'm a PhD-holding historian, a professor, and the creator of History That Doesn't Suck, a podcast that makes legit, seriously researched American history come to life through entertaining stories. Join me for a chronological telling of the United States story, from the Revolution to fractious Civil War, tenacious inventors, brave reformers, and more. With more than 100 episodes, you can already binge listen your way from 1776 to the early 20th century. Listen to History That Doesn't Suck on Spotify.
Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to episode 459 of our Civil War podcast. My name is Rich.
And I'm Tracy. Hello y'all, welcome to the podcast.
As promised in the last show, this episode will be a bit of a postscript to the just concluded Making Mississippi Howl story arc, as we look at what actually did happen to Federal Cavalry Commander Major General William Soy Smith, who was missing in action when Sherman reached Meridian.
As y'all will recall, William Tecumseh Sherman wanted Smith to lead a strong force of Union cavalry from Memphis in western Tennessee down into northern Mississippi, following the line of the Memphis and Ohio Railroad to Meridian, where Smith would meet up with Sherman, who would arrive there after marching right across central Mississippi from Vicksburg.
But, as we said in the last episode, other than receiving a message saying that the cavalry had made a belated departure from Memphis, Sherman then didn't hear a thing from Smith and had no idea what had happened to him. When Sherman reached Meridian on February 14th, there was no sign of Smith, even though Sherman had expected the cavalry to arrive there before him.
Sherman spent 6 days visiting destruction upon Meridian and the surrounding area. During that time, he saw neither hide nor hair of Smith. Finally, William Tecumseh Sherman started his march back to Vicksburg on February 20th, still not knowing what had happened to William Soy Smith or the 7,000 Union cavalrymen who were supposed to have met him at Meridian.
In mid-January 1864, William Tecumseh Sherman was pleased when Ulysses S. Grant gave him the green light to carry out his plan to strike at Meridian. But there was one thing that troubled Sherman. As he went about making his final arrangements for the operation, Sherman learned that William Soy Smith, Grant's chief of cavalry, was to command the force of Union horsemen that would meet Sherman in Meridian. Sherman wasn't happy about this because he didn't think Smith was the right man for the job.
The 33-year-old Smith was born to Soy Smith and Ann Hedges Smith in Tarleton, Ohio. He graduated from Ohio University at age 18, then sought and received an appointment to West Point. He graduated 6th of 52 in the class of 1853.
Smith resigned his commission a year later to accept a position as a civil engineer with the Illinois Central Railroad, but he lost that post because of poor health. After 2 years of teaching school in Buffalo, New York, in 1857 he was a founding partner of an engineering firm that worked on the international bridge between the United States and Canada across the Niagara River, and then on the Charleston and Savannah Railroad Bridge near Savannah, Georgia.
At the outbreak of the Civil War, Smith left his work in Georgia to return to Ohio and volunteer for military service. He became colonel of the 13th Ohio in June 1861. In the late summer and fall of 1861, the 13th Ohio saw service in western Virginia, most notably in the fighting at Carnifex Ferry in September. Smith was commended by William Rosecrans for his performance there.
At the end of the year, Smith was given command of a brigade in the Army of the Ohio. He commanded that brigade at Shiloh in April 1862 and the subsequent advance to Corinth, Mississippi. He was promoted to brigadier general in recognition of his performance at Shiloh. After the occupation of Corinth, Smith's engineering skills were put to work as he was put on special duty working on the rail lines in southern Tennessee. When that work was completed, he was given command of a division in the Army of the Ohio in July 1862.
His division wasn't heavily engaged at the Battle of Perryville in Kentucky in October 1862. Then, in early 1863, Smith was transferred to the Army of the Cumberland, where he commanded a division through the Vicksburg campaign.
After the fall of Vicksburg, Smith was bedridden by a severe attack of what was likely rheumatoid arthritis, a condition that would plague him for the remainder of his life. Still, his performance during the campaign has so impressed Ulysses S. Grant that Grant recommended his promotion to Major General. Upon his recovery, Smith became Chief of Cavalry in the Department of the Tennessee, and in October 1863, Grant gave him the same position in Grant's expanded new command, the Military Division of the Mississippi.
Smith may have had Grant's full confidence, but he didn't have Sherman's. In fact, knowing that Smith's main adversary would be the formidable Confederate cavalry commander Nathan Bedford Forrest, Sherman in December had expressed his misgivings to Grant, saying plainly, "I deem General W. Soy Smith is too mistrustful of himself for a leader against Forrest."
Later, after Smith's failure to carry out his part of the plan during Sherman's strike on Meridian, Sherman would state plainly that if it had been his choice, Smith wouldn't have played any role in the enterprise, saying, "I had not the selection of General William Soy Smith. Grant selected him." If Sherman had been able to have his way, he would have had Colonel Benjamin Grierson in charge of the cavalry force that would meet him in Meridian. Grierson's name may be familiar to you guys from his famous 600-mile raid from Tennessee down through Mississippi to Louisiana in April 1863 that was designed to distract the Confederates' attention while Grant moved on Vicksburg. So, Grierson was a successful and experienced cavalry raider. Sherman may have found some comfort in the fact that Grierson would ride with Smith as a de facto second-in-command. As it turned out, though, Grierson wouldn't have much influence on the course of events.
As Sherman set about making final arrangements for his strike on Meridian, he met with Smith in January 1864 to make sure Smith understood his orders. Writing later of that meeting, Sherman said, "I explained to him that in his route he was sure to encounter Forrest, who always attacked with the vehemence for which he must be prepared."
Well, Sherman's remarks were surely intended simply to prepare Smith for what to expect during his ride to Meridian, but in reality, all Sherman's warning did was ratchet up William Soy Smith's already considerable anxiety over the prospect of running into Nathan Bedford Forrest.
We've met Nathan Bedford Forrest before on the podcast, of course. In February 1864, he was 42 years old. After quarreling with Braxton Bragg in the aftermath of the Confederates' hollow victory at the Battle of Chickamauga, Forrest was transferred to serve under Major General Stephen D. Lee in Mississippi.
Bonus points, if you remember, we said Lee was in charge of the Confederate cavalry in the Department of Alabama, Mississippi, and East Louisiana. Leonidas Polk, the Bishop General, was the department commander. In any case, for his part, Lee couldn't have been more pleased about Forrest's transfer. On November 7, 1863, he sent Forrest a letter of welcome, saying, "You shall have all the assistance and support I can render you." Lee told Forrest he looked forward to working with, quote, "so gallant an officer as yourself."
Forrest was glad about the transfer away from Braxton Bragg, but the circumstances of his departure meant he had to leave behind all but a handful of his veteran troopers, and so he would have to raise an almost entirely new cavalry command. He did so by riding behind Union lines in West Tennessee and recruiting in that region, where his reputation and personal presence worked wonders in drawing men to join his ranks.
By December 8th, Forrest could report, "I am highly gratified with my success so far. Men are flocking to me in all quarters." One volunteer wrote, "I determined to cast my fortunes with the daring and dashing Forrest. He was constantly receiving recruits."
However, by Christmas 1863, Forrest's recruiting trip into western Tennessee was coming to a close. Strong federal forces were in the field, determined to stop him, so he withdrew to northern Mississippi.
There, as the calendar turned over from 1863 to 1864, Forrest started the work of transforming his band of recruits into a fighting force. He knew it would not be easy, but he reported, "I have nevertheless 3,100 new troops and hope soon to do good service with them."
Hey there, I'm Dylan Lewis, one of the hosts of Motley Fool Money. Each weekday on Motley Fool Money, we talk through the business news you need to know and the stories moving stocks on Wall Street. On weekends, we dive into the industries shaping tomorrow and host the experts, authors, and executives that understand them. Tune in for insights, a long-term perspective on investing, and of course, stock ideas. Plenty of them. To quote a listener, it pays to listen. Check us out and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts.
Napoleon Bonaparte rose from obscurity to become the most powerful and significant figure in modern history. Over 200 years after his death, people are still debating his legacy. He was a man of contradictions, a tyrant and a reformer, a liberator and an oppressor, a revolutionary and a reactionary. His biography reads like a novel, and his influence is almost beyond measure. I'm Everett Rummage, host of the Age of Napoleon podcast, and every month I delve into the turbulent life and times of one of the greatest characters in history, and explore the world that shaped him in all its glory and tragedy. It's a story of great battles and campaigns, political intrigue, and massive social and economic change. But it's also a story about people, populated with remarkable characters. I hope you'll join me as I examine this fascinating era of history. Find The Age of Napoleon wherever you get your podcasts.
William Soy Smith's expedition got off on the wrong foot when he was late starting off from Memphis. Sherman had made sure that arrangements were made for Smith to command a cavalry force of impressive size, 7,000 strong, and as part of that concentration, a brigade of Union horsemen under Colonel George Waring was coming down from western Kentucky to join Smith at Collierville near Memphis.
However, no one could have guessed that because of difficulties encountered along the way, it would take Waring 18 days to make that 160-mile march. His troopers didn't begin to ride into Collierville until February 8th. Oh, by the way, Sherman had expected that Smith would reach Meridian by February 10th, but that obviously wasn't going to happen, since Smith had decided to wait for Waring to arrive before he set out on the 230-mile ride to Meridian.
Smith later stood by his decision to wait for Waring and delay his departure, but in real time he was obviously second-guessing that choice, because on February 11th he wrote to Ulysses S. Grant and admitted, "I have worried myself into a state of morbid anxiety that I will be entirely too late."
So, added to Smith's unease over the thought of facing Nathan Bedford Forrest was the anxiety produced by his decision to delay his departure. He knew Sherman's expectation was that he, that is Smith, would reach Meridian by February 10th, but by that date, Smith's force was only just starting out from its camps. And once in motion, Smith's worry and fear ratcheted up another notch with each passing day. The calendar was unforgiving, and there was no getting around the fact he was going to be terribly late reaching Meridian. Not only that, but the setting of the sun each day brought closer the inevitable clash with that devil Forrest.
The Federal horsemen, generally following the line of the railroad, rode south down into northern Mississippi, but by February 16th, there had still been no sign of Forrest. With no opposition, the Yankees went to work with a will, visiting destruction upon the countryside.
Sergeant James Larson, in Company H of the 4th U.S. Cavalry, had misgivings about the time spent burning and destroying crops and property. He said, "We made long stops on the march, while large detachments were sent out to burn or destroy everything that could be of use to the enemy. Every day fires could be seen in all directions. In fact, the expedition seemed to have turned into a raid with no other object than to destroy Confederate property, with no haste to move forward or join Sherman."
A lieutenant in a regiment of Tennessee horsemen drew a similar picture, saying, "This is a rich country, and there was an abundance of cotton and corn, barns laden with forage and provisions. Destruction reigned supreme everywhere. On every road, troops were set out, and scarcely a plantation or a field escaped."
Smith's force, like Sherman's columns, attracted a swelling flood of runaway slaves. When all was said and done, Smith would return to Memphis accompanied by a mass of contrabands numbering between 1,000 to 3,000 men, women, and children. He claimed later that this large number of escaped slaves severely restricted his mobility because he felt obligated to protect them, and this added burden negatively impacted his mission. Okay.
At any rate, as the Federals moved south, following the line of the Mobile and Ohio, destroying the railroad as they went and wreaking havoc on the surrounding countryside, it wasn't until February 20th that they ran into Forrest Confederates for the first time.
The Confederate horsemen the Federal cavalry encountered were from Colonel Jeffrey Forrest's brigade. The colonel, Nathan Bedford Forrest's younger brother, followed orders and fell back toward West Point, a town on the railroad about 15 or so miles northeast of Starkville, the present-day home of Mississippi State University.
Jeffrey Forrest had orders to fall back before the Federals because his older brother didn't want to hit the Yankees until he had his whole force on hand. Nathan Bedford Forrest was also under cautionary orders from Stephen D. Lee to await Lee's arrival with reinforcements before Forrest struck the enemy.
But Lee didn't start moving toward Forrest until the 18th, and by then Forrest had on hand more recent instructions from Leonidas Polk that were much more to his liking. You see, Polk had written that the Federal cavalry, quote, ought never to be permitted to escape you or make a junction with Sherman. It is of the highest consequence that this column before you be crushed.
Rather than shadowing and skirmishing with the Yankees while he waited for Lee's arrival, Forrest's preference was to attack, and so Polk's instructions were in perfect accord with his aggressive instincts.
In the meantime, Soy Smith was growing more and more apprehensive. He reached West Point and established his headquarters there on the afternoon of February 20th, but he seemed to have no intention of going any farther, nor would he remain where he was for long.
Nathan Bedford Forrest left Starkville on the afternoon of the 20th, heading for West Point. Over the next 2 days, in a series of clashes known today as the Battle of Okolona, Forrest would follow his instincts and attack the Yankee cavalry as he tried his best to destroy the enemy before they could retreat from northern Mississippi and return to western Tennessee.
Meanwhile, Smith passed an anxious and uncomfortable night in West Point. Besides finally making contact with Forrest's Confederates, Smith was not feeling well. An officer who visited headquarters later said he found Smith, quote, propped up with pillows in an armchair, ghastly pale, and evidently under great physical suffering.
By first light on Saturday, February 21st, Smith had decided to turn back to escape what he considered a trap. He was convinced the rebels would use the terrain ahead, where waterways would hem in the Federals on 3 sides, to ambush his column.
While most of his force was starting the retreat and heading north toward Okolona, Smith planned to cover his withdrawal with, in his words, quote, a push at Forrest, end quote. The aim of Smith's push was the destruction of Ellis Bridge, since if it were destroyed, it would put some valuable time and distance between the Federals and Forrest. But Jeffrey Forrest was determined to hold the bridge until his brother arrived on the scene, and he managed to do just that.
With the Yankees' failure to destroy the bridge, and with Nathan Bedford Forrest's arrival, the initiative now passed from Soy Smith's uncertain hands to Forrest's iron grip. On the Federal side, Colonel Waring noted that, quote, no sooner had we turned tail than Forrest saw that his time had come.
As the Federals retreated, Nathan Bedford Forrest sent word back to one of his brigade commanders, saying, I think they are badly scared. And, Forrest being Forrest, once he had put the scare on the enemy, he wanted to keep it on. He spurred ahead, leading the pursuit himself. This not only suited his instincts, but since he was uncertain about the fighting qualities of his new command, he felt that a lead from the front, hands-on command style would set the best example for them to follow.
Beyond West Point, the Federal rear guard made at least 2 stands, but were unable to hold back the hard-charging rebels, who were led by Forrest and his personal escort. Those 20 or so men were tough veterans who were some of the few troopers who had accompanied him to Mississippi from Chattanooga.
Hot on the heels of the Yankees, Forrest continued the pursuit until well after dark on the night of the 21st. Only after coming under fire from some of his own men in the darkness did he call a halt about 4 miles south of Okolona. By that time, Forrest had already sent out orders for the next day to his brigade commanders, ensuring they would bring all their men forward speedily to join him at the tip of the spear, as well as making certain a force was moving parallel to the Yankees' path, keeping on their flank, from which point it might be possible to cut off the enemy's retreat and bag the entire lot of them.
All of the Confederates were eager to run the Yankees to ground. On the 21st, as they rode after the enemy, they had been enraged by the sight of the devastated landscape north of West Point. One rebel said, quote, up to that date, nothing like this had been seen in our part of the country. There was a firm set resolution not only to give the ruthless enemy blow for blow, but to avenge the wrongs done to old men, women, and children, end quote. Another Confederate wrote that, quote, the men of our command were almost frenzied now because of the burning.
The Federals spent the night of the 21st-22nd with little rest or comfort. Later on, Smith would insist he had, quote, adroitly slipped out of the trap, end quote. While that may have been the spin he chose to put on it, the men of his command were under no illusions about what daylight would bring. The 21st had been bad enough, full of unrelenting pursuit and mounting pressure, but Colonel Thomas Brown of the 7th Indiana Cavalry sensed the worst was yet to come. He felt, he said, that, quote, "we were now hurrying forward to the day of our trouble."
On Sunday, February 22nd, once clear of Okolona, the Federal rear guard would benefit from good defensive positions as the road wound through 25 miles of broken, hilly, and wooded country. Nathan Bedford Forrest knew it would be hard to bring the Yankees to bay along that winding road, but he was determined to try.
By morning, his entire command still hadn't come up, but with what men he had on hand, he planned to slash at the enemy's flanks while continuing to push them hard. Before first light, he sent his brother's brigade out to the west of Okolona. Another brigade, having continued riding through the night until 3 a.m., was already to the east of town. Then, with the 400 or so men remaining to him, Forrest himself would stay right on the enemy's heels as he had the previous day.
But then, when the Federal rear guard, commanded by Grierson, made a stand at Okolona, Forrest rode over to the force of 1,200 Confederates east of town and personally led a wild charge that thundered down upon the Yankees.
The rebel attack threatened to cut off the Federal rear guard from the main body. Trying to stop the Confederate charge was like trying to hold back the tide, and it wasn't long before panic broke out among the desperate Federals as regiments dissolved in flight. The collapse spread with frightening speed. According to Colonel Lafayette McCrillis of the 3rd Illinois Cavalry, quote, "A stampede ensued. We became mixed up and generally confused, in a run all the way. Men falling all around, some from bullets, others knocked from their horses by the butts of guns, while some were surrendering."
When news of the disaster that had overtaken the rear guard reached Waring up the road north of Okolona, he wheeled his command about and deployed his regiments on either side of the road, allowing the refugees to pour through his ranks.
Together, Waring and Grierson protected the rest of the Federal column by holding a series of positions along the road, using regiments to conduct a brief blocking action, then leapfrogging them backwards past other units that in turn made a stand, and so on, again and again, and in that way frustrating the Confederate pursuit. Amid these brief delaying actions, the Federals made 2 determined defensive stands. During the first, Jeffrey Forrest was shot in the throat. He lived only a few moments, dying in his brother's arms.
Nathan Bedford Forrest was the eldest of a dozen children. When Forrest was 16, his father died, leaving him to provide for his widowed mother and his brothers and sisters. Jeffrey, the youngest, was born 4 months after their father's death. As a result, Bedford had raised Jeffrey almost as a son.
Here, Forrest knelt on the ground for a few minutes, cradling his dead brother's head and shoulders. Then he calmly rose, ordered an aide to see to Jeffrey's body, instructed Lieutenant Colonel W.E. Duckworth to take command of his brother's brigade, and then, in a cold fury, mounted his horse, ordered his bugler to sound the charge, and with only his staff and escort, he flew at the mass of Federals blocking the road ahead.
It was a savage fight, but the odds were against Forrest. Fortunately, more Confederates, led by Colonel Robert McCulloch, came pounding up the road, and the Federals fled. During the fierce combat, Forrest killed 3 Yankees and lost 2 horses shot from under him.
Late that afternoon, the Federals made their second determined stand. For the first time, the Yankees even charged their foes. In fact, Forrest would say it was, quote, "the grandest cavalry charge I ever witnessed." However, it was not the Federals' day. The rebels stood their ground, turning back at least 3 charges by the Yankees. More Confederates came up, but still the Federals fought on, ignoring orders to retreat. By the time the Yankees did pull out, it was close to dark. Forrest's men were nearly exhausted, and many were low on ammunition. So Forrest passed the baton to some late arriving rebels, and although they tried to continue the pursuit, by that time it was too dark for them to accomplish much, and the Federals successfully slipped away. The Battle of Okolona was over.
After his return to Collierville, Smith cited impressive statistics of destruction in an attempt to show that his part of Sherman's plan had been successful, even though he never made it closer than 80 miles to Meridian.
Smith claimed 2 million bushels of corn and 20,000 bales of cotton burned, 30 miles of railroad track destroyed, 3,000 horses and mules taken, and over 1,000 escaped slaves brought out. He also claimed to have inflicted over 600 casualties on Forrest, at a cost of only 54 Federals killed, 179 wounded, and 155 missing.
As is often the case with Confederate casualties, accurate numbers are hard to pin down, but realistic figures seem to be 27 killed, 97 wounded, and 39 missing.
As might be imagined, when William Tecumseh Sherman finally found out what had happened to Smith's cavalry force, he was less than pleased with Smith, especially when it was discovered that Forrest had bested Smith with a force that was less than half the number of the Union column. Sherman believed that with such an overwhelming force, Smith ought to have destroyed Forrest. For his part, Soy Smith refused to accept a particle of blame. For the rest of his life, he claimed that the expedition had been a success. On the Confederate side, while Nathan Bedford Forrest mourned the loss of his brother, he was nevertheless pleased with the performance of the men in his new command. Forrest, whose promotion to lieutenant general was dated February 25th, said the men he led at Okolona were, quote, worthy of veterans.
That means it's time for this episode's book recommendation, and our recommendation this time is The Battle of Okolona by Brandon H. Beck.
You can find a list of all of our book recommendations if you head over to the podcast website, which is www.civilwarpodcast.org. Also at the website, you can find information on joining the Strawfoot Brigade over on Patreon and supporting the podcast in that way, just like the newest members, Colin A., Jason, Fred, David W., Satu T., and Gail. A big thank you to each of them.
And thanks to all of you for listening to this episode of the podcast. Rich and I do hope that you join us again next time, but until then, take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.